Go. Oh. Good evening. It's so good to see you people. And I appreciate so much each one of you being here. And all our friends and brothers, and hi, Don, all our friends and brothers and sisters in Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania and Germany and the Philippines. God bless you. I'm going to jump right in because I want to have some time to summarize Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, because we're going to end creation tonight. And we've heard about the big explosion, and there's a very interesting article. And this is why I was talking last week about if people haven't kept up with the archaeological developments since the 21st century, in the last 20 years, you hardly know what you're talking about because there have been so much, and this is one of the more significant ones. And you have the page, it's page 81, and you have Lot and his daughters running from the explosion in Sodom. And this is about this explosion. It's a very interesting thing. In 2004, see what I mean? And between 2004 and it was examined for 4 years till 2008, and it's now in the process of becoming accepted history because it's authentic. And they discovered, down here in lower Iraq, right down here, they discovered a plaque that was in a stargazing observatory, and they've tested the plaque out to be about 1800 BC, which you know is very close to the time of Abraham, probably 1900 BC. So you're in that period with Abraham. And remember, Abraham was an eyewitness to the explosions of Sodom and Gomorrah, which, by the way, also took out 2 villages to the south, down, Sodom was up here in the lower Jordan Valley, just before the Dead Sea, and Gomorrah was along the side of the Dead Sea, and then these small villages were down here. And so, anyway, in this article, these stargazers that were at this observatory documented the fact that a huge flash came across the sky, and it came from the east to the west, so it came like this. Guess where that ends? That ends up right where Sodom and Gomorrah are, or were. And they say that there was this flash from the east to the west, and then they even heard an explosion, even though they probably, I don't know, were certainly hundreds and hundreds, maybe even 1,000 miles from the crash site. But they heard this explosion, and then for the entire night there was this red glow coming in from to their west. And that places it pretty much exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah were. And this is considered to have been an asteroid by a lot of scientists. The Bible and Bible believers accept it as the hand of God. And but I keep thinking, even if it was an asteroid, it was the hand of God. The thing's going in the right direction. It pretty much lands in the right spot. the timing is perfect with the Bible. These are just too many coincidences to be just a coincidence. I mean, I think to any fair-minded person, the evidence is pretty strong that what Abraham saw was a real explosion. Whether it was fire coming down from heaven or whether it was this asteroid, this explosion happened at the exact time and the exact place. And we talked about how Lot and his family, with the insistence of these two angels, left Sodom. And remember, this is Sodom, crazy Sodom at night, and the angels escorted this family, which was made up primarily of girls, right on through this maddening crowd of night seekers, and out the gates of Sodom. And then they were told not to look back, and the wife violated that and looked back. And obviously, the Bible says she looked back, but what in reality, it had to have been for quite a while. It wasn't just a glance over her shoulder. She stopped and looked and got caught up in the explosion of the city, just like the Pompeians got caught up in the explosion of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. And we saw images of these people who died on that exact place at that exact time. And now, almost 2,000 years later, you can look and see the image of that person and exactly where they took their last breath. And it's a pretty heavy thought. But so Lot's wife obviously suffered the same consequences as the people at Pompeii did. And that's the point. Now, what happens after that is Lot and the daughters don't know where to go. You got to remember that Lot, practically from probably his mid-20s on, had lived in Sodom. So where does a city slicker go when the city evaporates on you? He does try to go to Zoar, which was the most famous of the villages down in the south. Probably had like 500 people there, but they were Canaanites. And Canaanites weren't always real kind and friendly to foreigners. And Lot was a foreigner. He was a Hebrew. And so after a short stay in Zoar, they left Zoar because it wasn't safe. And Lot and his daughters end up in a cave. And in your notes, on page 81, with the picture of Lot and his two daughters running from the explosion, and way back in the background you can see the wife had stopped and was watching the events happening to Sodom and got caught up in the explosion. Right above it, I have listed some things which I think are very memorable. All through our life, we have to make a choice. Are we going to do it with what we believe God is saying to us? And if you're willing to listen, and I think we all try to listen, there are times that, we always think our prayers are hitting the ceiling. No, it's God's answers that are hitting the ceiling, and we're not receiving. But the thought is that Lot gave up what he wanted, living in the city with luxuries. He gave that up, and he ended up living in a cave. And you can compare that to the riches of Abraham. Abraham sought God's will. Lot sought his advantage. You know, he's a Christian, not a Christian, a good believing Jew 2,000 years before Jesus. But if you look at this list, he also loved materialism, and he ends up with nothing. And he also loved compromise, and he ends up losing everything. And he loved the Hebrew people that would later on become Israel. He loved them, but he ends up actually fathering enemies of Israel. And I'll tell you how that happens in just a couple minutes. And his family ends up in trickery and incense. And Sodom is reborn again in the cave. You remember when Noah, the flood wiped out sin? And then the DNA of sin came walking off the ark. And so that's when God knew that if he continued to give the human race choice, which he considered to be the most crucial point of living, if he continued to give the human race choice, there was always going to be sin. Noah's sons came off the boat with the DNA for sin. And here in this cave, you have to kind of accept the fact that probably the daughters considered their situation hopeless. They didn't know what or how many things survived Sodom and Gomorrah. Everything that they could see or experience. Hi, come on in. Everything that they could see and experience was death. And so it could have been that Lot's daughters literally thought that they would never find a husband or ever have a husband. And so they were getting pretty desperate. Who's going to take care of us in our old age? Does our family tree end with us? And so what they do, and I want to read this to you. I'm going to go to chapter 19. In Genesis, yes, thank you, Nelda. In Genesis chapter 19, and I'll start in verse 30. Now remember, Lot and his daughters are out in the wilderness in a cave, probably having some sort of a scratch garden so they'd have something to eat. And it says in 30, Lot and his two daughters left Zoar, that was the village, and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his two daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger daughter, "Our father is old, and there is no man around with the catalog around here to lie with us, and it is custom, which is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink." Remember Noah, who grew the vineyard and then drank it, and you had the difference between people that had an instinct for righteousness and the one that didn't. One of the brothers mocked the father and wanted to show him drunk and naked in his tent, where the other two sons wanted to preserve their respect and honor for their father, who was obviously an extremely great man, and they went in and covered him up. And here's another situation with the old wine. Let's have him drink wine and let's get him drunk again. And so the older daughter says to the younger daughter, in verse 33, that night they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and lay with him. He was not aware of it when she laid down or when she got up. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, last night I laid with my father. Let's get him drunk again tonight, and you can go in and lay with him to preserve our family line through our father. And you remember how Sarah got impatient for obvious reasons. She didn't have a baby. She was approaching 90 or something like that. And so she got so anxious, she stepped out in front of God and said, go sleep with my servant, and I can claim that child as my own. And that was not God's will, even though it was culturally accepted. And we know that in our culture, we have a lot of things that are accepted that are not of God. And so we have to keep making these choices in our life. And so here these daughters, again, jump out in front of God. They're not alone in the world at all. There's lots and lots of the population still around. But yet they step out in front of God and they sleep with their own father, which we call incest. It's in Leviticus, and it's chapter 18, verse 6. And you don't have to go there because I'm not going to go there, but that's the chapter that's got all the don'ts. And that is when God lays down the law. I mean, you can think, well, you know, Jacob married 2 women, and Adam and Eve was a single marriage, and so where is right and where is wrong? And it's a situation, again, where the culture will say one thing, but God will say something else. And it isn't until Moses, around 1500 BC, which is like what? 300 years after Lot, where God lays down the law for Moses to tell the people, you don't do this, you don't do that, you don't. And a lot of this in chapter 18 is about incest, about lying with one's sister, or lying with one's mother, or going on, lying with one's cousin. And these were all don'ts. And so from that time on, incest became a very known sin among the Israelites. Now remember, this is 1500 BC, so most of the world is still doing their thing, but the Israelites aren't, because they listen to God. And so you have this situation where these 2 girls both have babies. And if you look down towards the end of this chapter, let's pick it up in 36, and it says, so both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son and named him Moab, and he will be the father of the Moabites. And I think most likely every single one of you in the room know that the Moabites were traditional enemies of Israel, and they battled back and forth for centuries and centuries. So Lot produced the enemies of Israel. And here he was, a devoted Israelite before there was an Israel. And then the other daughter, 38, the younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ammi. And he was the father of the Ammonites. And the Ammonites become the biggest tribe among the Canaanites. They were so big that really in the Bible they went by their own name. They were not just Canaanites, they were the Ammonites. And the Ammonites were the largest tribe of Canaanites. So the failures of Lot just go on and on and on, and it all starts with one seed. What is that seed? I will do what I want to do. I will put me first, and I will do what's best for me no matter what. Where Abraham said, I want to do God's will. After all, remember way up at Haran? Abraham listens to God's promise and takes off for nowhere. He doesn't know where he's going. God just says, I'll tell you when you get there. And Abraham's brother says, no, I'm going to do what's best for me. I'm going to stay up here in this nice, cushy pastoral land and raise great cattle and great sheep. And he did. But he ends up as a failure before God, and that's where the Armenians come from. And the Armenians are still a culture today. They populate heavily in eastern Turkey and northern Iraq. They don't have a nation of their own. But the Armenians are also constant enemies of Israel. So you can see that a lot of the basic original enemies of Israel were all born through Israelites. Even Abraham, after Sarah dies and Abraham is a widower, he stays that way for a little while, and then he marries another woman. A lot of people don't know that, but he does. It's in the Bible. Her name is Keturah. And Abraham, of course, lies with his wife, and they have a baby, and they name the baby Midian, of the Midianites. There's another enemy of Israel. And so you can see the results of following God may be tough at first. Leave your country and go to nowhere. Go hide in a cave. Whatever it happens to be. Moses, head out across this wilderness. This wilderness, the Sinai Peninsula, couldn't keep a rabbit alive. And you got, the Bible says 1.5 million people with you. That's a lot of rabbits. And yet God provided for them. He provided food. He provided water. He provided protection with the pillars, the pillar of the cloud and the pillar of light. God provided all the essential things that Israel needed while they were out in a place that was absolutely nothing. The original word for Sinai, by the way, was the desert of sin. And that's before sin even became sin. But what sin meant was to miss the mark. And so the Sinai Peninsula, if you were in the Sinai Peninsula, you had missed the mark. You were somewhere you didn't want to be, and you had nowhere to go. Everywhere you went, it was the same. Absolutely no water, no food, nothing green. So each time, the people who have led a successful life are people who were obedient to God. And in every case of a person who went their own way, which at the moment seemed like a really good idea, it turned out to be a failure. And that's pretty much the story of Lot. And you have on page 83 the story of the founding of Sodom and Gomorrah. See, for thousands of years, Sodom and Gomorrah was considered a myth. It was just a biblical joke. It didn't really happen. And then in the 20th century, they discovered it did happen. There was a Sodom and Gomorrah. And in the 21st century, which is our 2000s, they have examined Sodom and Gomorrah in detail. They're now accepted as history. They really did exist. Here, somewhere. No. Here. Here is a picture of the heap of Sodom. And today it's called Tel al-Haman. Tel al-Haman. And it's up at the top of the Dead Sea. They've discovered it had 62 acres in a walled city, and an additional 40 acres outside of the wall that was still part of the city. And at that time of 1800, that made it one of the bigger cities in the world. A city of probably between 12 to 20,000, which was a big city. And and they are doing research on that. And remember, I showed you this picture last week up here. And that, by the way, that black line that's halfway through the top picture, about halfway down into that area, that you have to dig down to get to the surface at that time, because as time goes on, layers of soot continue to fill in the land to a point where literally something that happened 2,000 years ago may be 10 feet or more below the surface. But that black line is put in there by the people who produced the picture. And that black line shows you the top level of a 3-foot layer of ash all over the city. Well, how in the world do you have ash? You have burnt property, right? The only way ash becomes ash is if it's part of a burnt property. 3 feet of it. And they have discovered through the archaeological analysis of this area, plus all the historic evidence, that Sodom and Gomorrah and the rest of this Salt Sea nations, you remember called the League of Salt Sea States, all disappeared suddenly in a chaotic catastrophe at the same time in 1800 BC, which is exactly the timing archaeologists have put on this ash layer. And not only that, but the Chronicles, you got to remember, Sodom and Gomorrah were just not mythical names. They were real places, and they were more than real places. They were important places, and everybody around them dealt business with them and bought the salt. Remember, salt was the second most valuable element in the world next to gold, because salt could preserve, it could give taste, it could give flavor. The modern word I would use is can, but you could preserve all sorts of meats and fruits and things like that. So salt was so crucial. And all the nations had Sodom and Gomorrah in their chronicles. The chronicles are the records kept by a city. You know, they keep their own records, and they all had Sodom and Gomorrah. And then comes 1800 BC, and it stops immediately, and there is never a mention of Sodom and Gomorrah again in any of these nations. That's an amazing historical fact. I mean, the finger is so big and so clear to point to the accuracy of the Bible. I think a person would have to be foolish to deny this evidence. Here's an interesting picture. It shows you the graveyards. In Sodom alone, outside of Sodom alone, they have found over 20,000 graves. 20,000 graves outside of Sodom alone. And you see these holes, and you say, well, those holes don't look really big. Are you sure that's a grave? Yeah, because the soil was so hard in this area, people were literally buried standing up, not laying down like we do in our traditional burials. And so you only dug a hole big enough to lower a person who then would spend eternity standing on their feet. And so that's why those holes look small. Now, there's been a lot of grave robberies, and that's really tragic because there's just so much treasure and history that's been damaged and disappeared. But in these pages, I even have a little article about a German archaeologist who has saved like over 700 graves that had not been bothered or touched in any way. I know you say 700 out of 20,000. Well, yeah, I guess. Doesn't sound like a huge number. But when you consider all the 4,000 years of robbery and desolation that these grave robbers caused with these graves, that they didn't want it, they didn't put it back, they threw it away. And so 700 is considered in the archaeology science, archaeological science, a real accomplishment. So anyway, that's what I thought I would spend some time on is we got about a half an hour. Is creation is now ended. I end creation with Sodom and Gomorrah, because then you can start into the history of the Hebrew people. Remember I told you in Genesis, Abraham is the first human being to be called Hebrew, actually Habaru, but the Habaru for the Canaanite was Hebrew for the Israelite. And actually the word Hebrew means to wander. When you think of Abraham's lifestyle, perfect name for a perfect guy. He wandered with his sheep and his cattle up and down between Bethel and Beersheba. And that's where he lived his life. And he became so successful that even nations, like the Philistines, for example, nations feared him and were concerned about him. And remember that Abraham overnight literally could draw 318 men that would go and fight and die for him because they owed him so much, because Abraham was so kind and generous with his neighbors and friends and servants. And we know that story about what they did with the Babylonians. So anyway, I would like to give you, and that's what you should have in front of you, a sheet. It's very simple. It's very sketchy. It's almost so don't laugh. I just said that on international television. Don't laugh. You go ahead and laugh all you want to. But the first 3 generations after Abraham are really the foundation of the Hebrew culture. And it starts with Isaac. Isaac was the son of Abraham and Sarah. And when Isaac was about 3, Ishmael was 14. And And Ishmael's mother, Hagar, stuffed his head full of hateful thoughts about his brother, which centered around, as long as your brother's around and Sarah's his mother, you're not going to get anything out of this. You're not even probably considered by Abraham to be a son anymore. And so Sarah started to notice that Ishmael was always criticizing, and that's not the word that's strong enough, saying hateful things to Isaac. So Sarah, and I think this was correct, Sarah started to think, if Ishmael hates Isaac, what's going to stop him from not killing Isaac? I mean, we wander. You can wander away from the tents, and within, 40 feet, you're in wilderness with animals and gullies and rocks and thorns and all sorts of stuff. And so what's going to stop Ishmael from killing Isaac? And so she goes to Abraham and says, you got to get rid of this guy. Yeah, he's big, he's strong. Isaac's just a tiny child. He could so easily push him into a gully and say, well, poor little Isaac just fell into this gully and died, And so Abraham saw that could be a real fear. And so he sends Hagar and Ishmael away. He gives them some food and some belongings and clothing and a donkey and sends them away. And remember, I told you that in the Bible, Hagar goes from probably Beersheba down here, down to here, which was Hey Lahai Rogai. And remember, the first time she went down there, God told her where water was, a spring was, and she named God the God who sees me. And she comes back, and an angel tells her, go back to your master and continue to live with him. It's not your time. Well, this is the second time that she goes to Beer Lahai Rohai. She gets down there and she stays for a while. In fact, then she sends word over to Egypt, and some relatives in Egypt send her a girl for Ishmael to marry. So the beat goes on there too. So Sarah, again, disappears from the Bible and disappears from Abraham and his clan. And actually, Ishmael starts another clan, a second clan, the clan of Arabs. And he has 12 tribes too. And once again, when Hagar gets down there, she ran out of water. And again, an angel shows her where there's a well that's very close to the surface and she can get to. So once again, she says, this is the God who sees me. This is the God who saves me. And that's the beginning of that line of Abraham. So Abraham actually produces, the line of Israel, the promised child, the line of the covenant. But he also produces the Arab race, and God promises Abraham that he will take care of the Arab race, that he will take care of Ishmael and his offsprings and treat them kindly. And then, of course, remember I just told you Abraham, after Sarah died, got lonely and married a woman named Keturah, and they had a baby named Midian, who becomes another enemy. So Abraham, in his old age anyway, doesn't do himself any favors by, it would have been best, of course, and I believe, done in the Bible, but I believe God probably told Abraham just rejoice and live the rest of your life with the memory of Sarah. And that's what he should have done, but he didn't. So there. So Isaac, I say on your list here, Isaac was righteous. I suppose kind of like a Lot. He was righteous, but he wasn't as wise or as strong as his father Abraham was. But of course, you could ask the question, okay, give me a list of the guys that are stronger and wiser than Abraham. It'd be a very, very short list. But Isaac was a good, righteous man, but he didn't give up on some of the emotional issues. Like, for example, when Rebecca has babies, she has two, and she becomes very concerned towards the end of her pregnancy because the two babies inside of her are fighting and struggling with each other. And she says, what's going on in this, you know? And finally, when the babies come out, amazingly enough, they come out really together. They come out first Ishmael with Jacob holding on to the foot of, I said Ishmael, I'm sorry, Esau. I apologize to the world that I said the wrong. It's Esau. Esau comes out first, and then right behind, actually holding on to his foot, is Jacob. And sure enough, these two brothers, who are twins actually, but they weren't anything, they didn't look anything alike, will be very competitive and struggle with each other throughout their lives. Esau, not so much, because Esau just didn't care that much. Esau was a huntsman. He is a rough and ready guy. Go out into the woods and, well, it weren't woods, out into the wilderness and kill stuff and bring it back. And he was a tough guy. And his brother, Jacob, pretty much stuck around the camp and didn't really venture out very much at all. And so Jacob's role models basically were women that worked around the tents, where Esau's role models were rough and ready men. So you can see they went in totally different directions. Jacob became a manipulator. And you think, hold it, now isn't Jacob the father of the 12 tribes of Israel? And isn't he a great man in the Bible? Yes, but not at first. Jacob's got a lot of lessons to learn, probably a lot like most of us, got a lot of lessons to learn in life before we begin to shape up. And so Jacob was a manipulator, and to make it worse, even though Isaac and Rebekah loved each other, and there was no question of that, Rebekah particularly competed with Isaac. And Rebekah's favorite son was, of course, Jacob, the kid that hung out with her all day long. And Isaac's favorite son was Esau, because Esau would go hunting and bring Isaac a bunch of good stuff to eat. And Isaac liked that a lot. And he considered Esau to be the one that really took care of him. And Rebekah saw Jacob as the one who was her companion as well as her child. And so what happens here, and I guess I should read part of this to you. I'm going to start in Genesis 25, and let's go to 28. Genesis 25, 28. Oh, and here's a perfect example of what exactly we were talking about in verse, let me go to 23 first. And this is about Jacob and Esau. And the Lord spoke to Rebekah And he says, you have two nations in your womb. That's why they're fighting. He says, and two peoples from within you will be separated. Esau is the father of the Edomites, another traditional enemy of Israel. Jacob would become the father of Israel. Jacob is the one who has 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. And everybody in Israel, everybody who is not only Jewish but is Hebrew, has come from one of those 12 tribes. Now, there are many Jews in the world that are not Hebrew. They're African, they're Chinese, they're Russian, they're German, some. But even though that's true, if you are Hebrew, you are from one of those 12 tribes. And if you're a good Hebrew, you know what your tribal history is. And so here it says, the two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, Israel. But get this, and the older will serve the younger. So here's a prophecy from God right away that says that Jacob is going to dominate Esau. Well, what Jacob does is he goes into his manipulation. During that time, men were everything, and women served men. They had babies, they stayed in the tent, they cooked, they took care of stuff, they managed the household, but the man was everything. He had the power, he had the position, and so the only way a woman could really express herself was through manipulation, honestly. It's the only way they could express their feelings was through manipulation. And so that's what Jacob learned. And so Jacob manipulated his brother, who Jacob made a delicious stew, and his brother came home hungry as a horse. Jacob said, "Are you hungry?" "Yes, give me a whole bunch of that stew." And Jacob says, "Yes, I will, but first, I want you," and here it is. It's in verse 33 of 25, and it says, "But Jacob said, 'Swear to me first.' So he swore an oath to him, selling him his birthright for some stew." I didn't ever say that Esau was the greatest mind on the face of the earth. I just said he was a tough guy. But Esau sold his birthright. And of course, how much ahead of Jacob's birth was he? Oh, I know, 6 inches, so they're very close. But Jacob tricks Esau by going to Esau's weakness. He loved food and he loved to eat and he was hungry. And he got Esau to give up his birthright to Jacob. And it says here that Esau despised his birthright. In other words, he said, "Oh, birthright, what's that? It doesn't matter to anything. If Jacob tries something, I'll just beat him up, and that'll settle the issue." So that's how Jacob actually got the birthright. Now, the birthright has to be honored by the father, or it doesn't count for much. And so Esau goes out hunting for Isaac and promises to bring him back some delicious food. And Rebekah sides with Jacob. And Isaac sides with Esau. And probably being the authority, Isaac didn't pay any attention to the competition because he didn't think it very seriously. Well, Rebekah cooks up the same stew that Esau cooks up. And and at that time, Esau had very bad eyesight, probably what today we would call cataracts, and he could see, but everything was kind of blurry. And Isaac had bad eyes. Who did I say have bad eyes? Okay. Just erase the last 2 minutes. I said the wrong word. Thank you, Nelda. Isaac had bad eyesight, and so he couldn't see real clearly. So Rebekah says, go in and pretend you're Esau and get your father's blessing. And Joseph says, well, I'm clean-skinned, and Esau's real hairy and woolly. Jacob said that. I'm sorry. I guess I'm thinking too much of my story and not bothering with the names. Jacob said to his mother that I am clean-skinned, and as soon as my father touches my arm, he'll know I'm not Esau. So Rebekah literally takes some animal skins and makes a kind of a sleeve for Jacob, so that when Isaac feels Jacob's skin, it'll be woolly. And sure enough, Jacob goes in, lies his brains out to his father. I forget how many times he lies. His father asks him questions, and Jacob lies. And father asks him questions, and Jacob lies and lies and lies. But then Jacob gives Isaac the stew he really wanted. And he tastes the stew and he says, yep, that's Esau. And so Isaac gives his blessing to Jacob. So Jacob has completed the circle of power on Esau. And Esau comes home and finds that Isaac has already had dinner, the exact same dinner, and so there's nothing left except for Esau to get mad. And Esau gets very mad. He says, I'm going to kill this kid. Now, I don't think he said kill this kid, but he was talking about doing Jacob away. And so Rebekah comes to Jacob and says, you got to get out of here because Esau wants to kill you. And so Jacob leaves, and he goes back up to Haran, where, remember, the relatives are, Nahor's relatives. And at this time, a guy by the name of Laban was the son up there, and he was the guy who ran all these businesses up in Haran. And it was rich, and he was a very wealthy and powerful person. Literally had like 1,000 servants and things like that. And so he welcomes Jacob, but then he begins to out-manipulate Jacob, the manipulator. So Jacob gets beat at his own skill. He gets out-manipulated by Laban. And Jacob falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, who is named Rachel, which by all accounts in the Bible was a very beautiful young woman. And Rachel had an older sister that was named Leah, and Leah was very average. In fact, the Bible says she had weak eyes. Exactly what that means, I don't think anybody knows, but it's probably not good. And so on their wedding night, Laban switches Rebekah and puts Leah in the bride's seat. And he gets Jacob too drunk to know. And if he probably knew, he didn't care. So then Jacob goes in and lies with his new bride, which solidifies the marriage. And he wakes up the next morning and it's Leah. And so Laban says, oh, you want Rachel? Oh, well, another 7 years of free labor, and I think I can manage that. And so Jacob spends 14 years up there working for Laban for free. And Jacob gets very, very good, like his grandfather Abraham. He gets very, very, very good at raising herds. And so the battle goes on. Eventually, Jacob takes his wives. He's got 2 wives now because he legally married Leah and he legally married Rachel. Leah's a wonderful woman. And because she's kind of semi-ignored by Jacob, God blesses her with being the mother. And most all of the tribe is either born through her or through her servant, which we've talked about before with Sarah and Hagar. And so Rachel isn't having babies, and she's very bitter about that. Why is God cursing me? I can't have babies, and this is so cruel. And what it is, God wasn't cursing Rachel. God was protecting Rachel because with the second child she gives birth to, Benjamin, she's going to die in childbirth. So all this time, rather than God being mean to Rebekah, he was saving Rebekah's life. That's one of the secrets of the kingdom and why you got to stick with God, because he really knows the best. But Rachel's first child is Joseph. And I think I only have a couple minutes, so I'm just going to tell you one thing that maybe you don't understand, some people maybe don't understand, is that though Joseph certainly wasn't the oldest, in fact, I think he was next to the youngest, Jacob, like his father Isaac, picks favorites. And that's a sin. You know, if you're going to love children, love all your children. Love isn't something that is divisible like a pie. Love is something that multiplies. And the more love you have, the more love there is. That's God's secret in the kingdom. We on earth think, well, if you love somebody else too, I'm getting less love. Not according to God. And so what happens here is Jacob favors Joseph, and he puts on him a coat of many colors. Now, a coat of many colors means something. In all of the courts of the lands around Israel, and including Israel, the crown prince of all these brothers, the one that's next in line to be the king, the most important kid in the group, is always identified in colorful form. That's where the purple comes in. A lot of the purple, the crown prince would be wearing purple while all the other brothers would be wearing brown or something like that. So it's very obvious who the selected child was. So that's the thing about the coat of many colors. When Jacob put the coat of many colors on Joseph, he was saying to the world and to the rest of his sons, Joseph's going to be the one. And the brothers all resented him. And then Joseph has a dream, and I'll end with this point. Joseph has a dream in which he sees all the brothers bowing down to him. But Joseph, and it's probably one of the last foolish mistakes Joseph makes, because Joseph is an incredibly righteous, honorable person. Joseph goes and tells his brother, hey, guess what? I had a dream. You guys all bow down to me. Isn't that fun? You know? And so none of the brothers like it. So they throw him in a well and they're going to kill him. And then two of the brothers that didn't want him to die, Judah and Reuben, say, well, let's sell him into slavery. That's as good, and you don't kill him. Yeah, okay, we'll do that. So some slave owners come by and buy Joseph, and Joseph goes off to Egypt, and that's the beginning of that story. And God bless you people for showing up tonight. I love you, truly love you. You're very, very, very important to Nelda and I. And have a wonderful evening.